What do you think about sending American troops to Ukraine? No, right? I mean, the vast majority of the American public is against that. Every time that comes up in a poll, it's something like 20% say that we should even consider that as an option for supporting Ukraine. But there's an article that just came out arguing exactly for that. I mean, they don't say boots on the ground, but it's not hard to read between the lines here. Right? This was a recent article that came out in Foreign Affairs, which is the publication for the Council on Foreign Relations think tank, talking about why America should send military advisors to Ukraine. Now, one thing to keep in mind as we're digging into this is a lot of these think tanks, it's not 100% of the time, it's not in every situation, but a lot of times they can be used to kind of gauge public sentiment for future policies, right? Kind of test the waters and see how that's going to come across. So it's not the administration or the government actually saying this is something they're going to do, or even having to say, in an official communication that this is something we're considering. But through these think tanks, they sometimes can kind of get an understanding of how something is received. Additionally, some of these think tanks put out pretty detailed information about their funding sources. Council on Foreign Relations isn't exactly one of them. They keep it pretty broad, breaking it down between like grants and dedicated grants, things like that. But the actual source of those funds, be them from government entities or private organizations, that's not for public consumption. So keep that in mind as we're digging into this. Now, starting out, they say Washington should lift the restrictions on the number of U.S. government personnel allowed in Ukraine and begin stationing military advisors within the country and across its defense apparatus. Now, one of the big things they get at here is that the bang for the buck is cheap. It's just relatively inexpensive to put our people on the ground right there as close to the front lines as possible without getting them in harm's way to provide some of these trainings and resources to the Ukrainian troops in the fight. They say sending advisors would increase the number of Ukrainian soldiers who receive top-of-the-line training. Maybe. Overall, I don't think this is a good idea. All right, I'm going to get that out of the way right away. I think this would be a mistake right now to put more U.S. troops in Ukraine. We do have some people there in the embassy, around a security detail, that kind of thing. And I think we've got some others in the western part of the country helping to kind of track arms shipments in. That's not what they're arguing for here. They're not saying more people to track arms shipments or more for embassy security. This is deliberately tied to assisting Ukrainians' war effort. So when it comes to more troops able to receive top-of-the-line training, I would say just stand up more resources in Poland, in eastern Poland, right? Just get them inside of a NATO country. I understand that it's not as close to the front lines as possible, but, is it that crazy to, maybe instead of moving them to Germany or to the United States for training, which takes a long time, Poland's not that far. Can we not just ramp up efforts there? They say it would enhance Washington's understanding of Kyiv's material needs, allowing U.S. policymakers to fine-tune the aid they already provide and offer psychological assurance to Ukraine. I'm not so sure about the psychological assurance to Ukraine. There's going to be more on that here in a little bit. In terms of fine-tuning the aid that is necessary for Ukraine, the lines of communication there are pretty open. Whether the two sides decide to be forthright and forthcoming with the needs and what's available and what could be sent is a different story. But there's no lack of communication between the two parties, right? They've all got their phones. They can jump on a phone call at any point with countless people on each side to talk about what's working and what's not working. I don't know that putting people on the ground is solving that problem necessarily in a way that can't be done somewhat remotely. And finally, they add that putting more troops on the ground would let Washington better champion crucial defense reforms that could pave Ukraine's path towards NATO and EU membership. Look, if you take the context away that this is an active war zone, all for it, right? Let's put, if there's another country in a similar situation that we're trying to pull into NATO, trying to help their, accession into the European Union, and we say maybe we should put more troops there, maybe we should put more State Department personnel there, fine. Great. That's a different conversation. I can understand why we would want that to be done, but we cannot ignore the fact that this is the middle of a war zone, right? All of Ukraine is under the prospect of being hit by Russian missile and drone strikes. It is a contested area. We just can't brush that aside and say, well, we'll put them there so they can pave the path towards NATO and EU membership. It seems like we're looking past the immediate threat a little bit in that sense. Now, they do, to be fair, get into some of the reasons why people are pushing back against this. They say one of the most obvious is that this could prompt Russian President Vladimir Putin to escalate the conflict. And that, I've brought it up before. I think there's been so many red lines crossed in this conflict without any, significant repercussions that it's easy to ignore them entirely and say there are no red lines. But they most certainly exist. There is a line in there somewhere to where this conflict escalates and maybe goes outside the borders of Ukraine. I don't know where that is. We've gotten that wrong in the past, right? There's been repeated instances of Ukraine doing things, whether it's the receipt of Western military aid, that was a red line. Striking inside of Russian-occupied territory. At the time, it was Crimea. That was a red line. Striking inside of Russia was a red line. There were even, Ukrainian-backed incursions by the Russian Volunteer Corps and the Freedom of Russia Legion into sovereign Russian territory. That was a red line, right? And nothing really came from any one of those, but we can't write that off entirely. So, putting U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine or from any country does, to me, that is a substantial step towards what could be escalation at some point in the future. Bringing up another concern, they say one of those is that this could lead to an endless American military commitment, adding, but Kyiv does not want Washington to defeat Russia on its behalf. It is not South Vietnam. I disagree with all of that. Well, I agree with the first part that it could lead to endless military commitment, but the idea that Ukraine does not want Washington to defeat Russia on its behalf, step back real quick on that. If Ukraine could push a button and Russia was eliminated and no longer a threat to their country, I have a feeling Ukraine would push that button all day long. There's been an argument from the very beginning of this conflict that I think is worth paying attention to, and it's the idea that Ukraine, in a sense, again, we talk about countries acting in their own self-interest, right? Ukraine's interest is Ukraine. Ukraine is not looking out for the interests of the United States. So there is an argument from very early in this war that Ukraine has wanted to pull NATO and the United States closer into this conflict because then there's the greater chance of the defeat of Russia, right? So I don't think it's an accurate statement at all to say that Kyiv does not want anybody else to defeat Russia. They'd be very happy if that happened, and understandably so. I would too if I was in their shoes. But the bigger concern here, to me at least, is this endless military commitment. And they're going to come back to that. Now, getting into the types of people that the Council on Foreign Relations would suggest sending to Ukraine. They say U.S. forces can serve in three distinct capacities. One type of advisor is the tactical level trainer. So the guys teaching medical skills, call for fire, basic rifle marksmanship, that kind of stuff, right? It's things that we're already helping Ukraine with their training, just not necessarily in Ukraine. We're doing these things in Poland, Germany, the United States, and elsewhere to help provide. We've talked about this in previous video. It's not perfect. It's not the exact situation that they're going to face when they go up against Russian forces on the battlefield, but it's that kind of entry-level training that NATO is stepping in some capacities and filling. The argument here is that we're only getting a small fraction of the Ukrainian force, and if we move that into the country, it will allow NATO to have a greater impact and train more people that can, more rapidly be rotated off the lines through this training program and then back to the front. They say the second type would be operational level advisors who could embed with the Ukrainian general staff and service staffs responsible for the war's strategy and its execution. This area and the next one are both areas that I'm certain are being done, just the number of tabletop exercises the Pentagon has talked about conducting with Ukraine. But this is more, at this point, done remote and some of these high-level meetings outside of Ukraine. I think it's valuable. It's important. It could play a big role in the success or failure of Ukraine going forward. I don't know that the answer to that necessarily is to add, a division staff somewhere in Kyiv to help supplement this, or even advisors, as they're talking about. They're using, they keep coming back to not necessarily conventional troops, but some of our security force assistant brigades, organizations like that are better trained in training, if you will. I just don't know that the solution to help Ukraine in that capacity means that we have to have people in Ukraine in harm's way, risking a potential escalation. They say the final type would be strategic level advisors who could work directly with Ukraine's government to lay the groundwork for EU and NATO membership. I don't see any reason at all that those people need to be in Ukraine to do that. These are very big picture geopolitical moves. It's something that we do with other countries outside of a wartime environment. It's something that's done at the ambassador level kind of thing, right? Those don't have to be people, traversing minefields in Ukraine to get that done. I don't think that's necessary. Again, in a peacetime environment, Sure, why not? Send some State Department people over, send some DOD advisors, no issue. In a war zone, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. They add the benefit that the United States would see from this. It's not just, to Ukraine's advantage, is they say we would acquire firsthand experience and insights from the Ukrainian battlefields that could prove indispensable to Washington, especially to have to fight against China or Russia in the future. We are getting a lot of lessons from the battlefield. And not just through formal. I mean, if you think about the amount of lessons learned just coming out over social media and public forums, it's crazy. I'm not sure we have the capacity to soak it all in and really delve into the different areas that we need to pay attention to for a future conflict. I don't know that the challenge here is that we're not getting enough of that information out. There's a massive amount of lessons learned being soaked up every single day. Again, if that's not necessarily a major issue right now, I don't know that we need to be looking at troops on the ground to solve that as a problem. Moving on, the article refers to this whole idea here as being low risk, high reward. And I would not say that it's the direct opposite. I don't think this is high risk, low reward. I would say high risk, maybe medium reward kind of thing. And they try to downplay the possibilities that this could lead to anything negative long-term for the United States. They say, in fact, the Kremlin has long tolerated U.S. military operations near its forces. I think that is no. Like, what are we doing here? Now, Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine, right? That's 100% on him. He's the one who decided to go to war and to expand this war from where it was in 2014. But one of the major arguments that he has been citing for so long is that the United States, NATO, and the European Union have been expanding their influence into what he views as his sphere of influence. So you might say that's wrong or it's not correct or he's got the wrong point of view. But right now, as this war in Ukraine is still being fought, to say that the Kremlin has tolerated this for so long, we should just keep going, I think that's really missing the ball, to be honest. They say in 2018, according to the New York Times, U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of Russian and Syrian forces in a single engagement in Syria without provoking any tangible response. Those are Wagner fighters. As we've come to learn, there is a bit of a rift between the Ministry of Defense and Wagner. It went back to then. At the time, they were still trying to figure out how to use this force in a way to where it wasn't exactly the Russian military. So, one way to blow your cover in that sense is a direct escalation from Russia. So it's not crazy looking back on that Russia didn't escalate because their mercenary soldiers were killed. That's kind of the point of them being mercenary soldiers. They say, and then from 2015 to 2022, Washington had military advisors in Ukraine, even as the country fought with Russia in its easternmost provinces. Correct. But again, that is one of the arguments that Russia used to expand this war in the first place. That doesn't mean we need to cower away from anything that might upset Russia, but to look at that and say that had no bearing at all on where we sit today, I think is a little bit naive. Continuing on, they say the United States could station the rest of their troops at a safe distance from the front lines, although still close enough to have a meaningful effect. And they talk about how, the U.S. embassy in Kyiv is protected by Patriot missiles manned by Ukrainian soldiers. And there's a very small difference here that, in my opinion, has a world of difference. If we start say we put a U.S. battalion-sized element into Ukraine, 500 to 1,000 soldiers on or about, and they're in some barracks, that becomes a pretty tempting target for Russia, right? We don't have to explain to the United States public why 500 of our soldiers were killed in a single missile strike. So we decide that we need to have that Patriot coverage around where the U.S. troops are housed. Common sense, right? We're just doing what we would do in a war zone. Are we going to trust that to the Ukrainian soldiers, or do you think we're going to put U.S. troops on those Patriot missiles? And if we do put U.S. troops manning those Patriot batteries, maybe we need to bring another one over so Ukraine can continue to use theirs where they see best fit. And now we're talking about, well, what about base security for where the U.S. troops are housed, right? We've got to make sure they're secure and fed and taken care of and the logistics trained. And next thing you know, it's not just those 200, 300, 400 trainers, but this footprint continues to expand. And I understand that is a slippery slope argument. It does not automatically mean that if we put people there, it will automatically move into this, large-scale military operation carried out by the United States. But we can't just completely brush that aside and say there's no chance it'll ever happen. Unfortunately, that's kind of where this article takes it. Now, this piece is worded very strangely, so I'm going to go through it word for word and then walk back and try to give a little better context. They say out of 82 cases of advisory missions by China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to countries experiencing civil war between 1946 and 2019, 28 ended without accompanying special operations forces or combat troops. So 28 out of 82 cases did not result in some sort of military escalation. If you frame that another way, you could say in 64% of cases since World War II, any sort of advisory mission has led to a broader escalation. If you phrase it that way, this seems like far from a slam dunk, right? And, I don't know exactly how closely this data would sync to a conventional war because, as they mentioned, they're talking about Civil War interventions. And there are some aspects of that, not as much right now, but at the beginning of the conflict, there were some aspects of that, or at least back in 2014 in the eastern part of the country. That's not much of a dynamic anymore across this overall battlefield. And then kind of wrapping up here, I think they misread the American public or just looking at the wrong data point to back up their argument here. They say, on the whole, support for helping Kyiv remains remarkably strong. A September CBS News poll, for example, found that 67% of Americans want the United States to give aid to Ukraine, which, look, that's accurate. Overwhelmingly, since the start of the conflict, the majority of Americans have been in favor of providing aid to Ukraine. And there are some outlying polls, but 67% is at least in the ballpark of where people are answering yes on that question. When you add in military aid, that number goes down. It has steadily decreased since the start of the war. It's still, the last I saw, most polls still have it above 50%. But that's not what this article is about. This article is not arguing for more or less aid to Ukraine or a different type of aid to Ukraine. This article is arguing for boots on the ground. They're not using that term, but that's what this argument is. And anytime I've seen that question asked, I've seen it as low as 15% say yes, but the highest I think I've ever seen in any poll for the American public supporting boots on the ground in Ukraine is like 25%. So I think I made it clear throughout this whole video that I do not agree with this argument that we should be putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. I don't think it's the right move for the United States. I don't think that's in our best interest. Now, if we're talking about outliers, this article is an outlier. I don't think I've seen a single argument, even from some of the most hawkish people on Ukraine policy, arguing that we should put U.S. troops on the ground, even in this capacity, this training and mentorship type capacity. But again, this is a pretty significant publication that's taken very seriously with decision makers in Washington. So I think it's interesting that it showed up here and made it to publish and is now being distributed. Something to think about. But that's all I've got for now. Be sure to check out the National Security Sit Reps I put out on Substack. It's once a week, 7 to 10 of the biggest national security stories, along with a few podcast recommendations. The link to that, as well as this article from Foreign Affairs, will be in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.